Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good argument that atheism is true.
Are there good reasons?
And secondly, there are good arguments that atheism is reasonable.
Are there, do you think?
Now, most carefully, the circumscribed limits those contentions. We're not here tonight to debate the social impact of religion or Testament ethics.
All right, so now let's move on and show the audience the argument proper. And there's a couple things I wanted to point to on this. First of all, it's notable that Craig uses a slightly different form of the argument here than he uses anywhere else. And we'll touch on that again in a moment. I'm going to include a graphic with the text that he typically uses, so you have that for reference. So now we will roll the B footage of the clip.
Consider first the Kalam cosmological argument. 1. If the universe began to exist, then there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, there is a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence.
Now that we've seen the argument proper, I would like to touch on what I feel is my fundamental problem with the Kalam cosmological argument. And I've touched on this already a little bit briefly. But that is, to make this argument, you have to posit that you can know things about the nature or the processes that it is actually of a realm that is beyond our ability to investigate, and possibly even beyond our ability to really understand. I mean, we're talking about the origin of the universe. Now, the theories we have right now, the Big Bang is the current theory, and that only goes back to a tiny fraction of a second before the actual start of the universe. We can't investigate any further than that. And the Big Bang isn't even necessarily an origin theory. It's talking about the rapid expansionary period in the early part of the universe. So that's my fundamental problem with the Kalam in any of its forms, is that it's making claims about a realm that we can't possibly understand. What do you think about that as far as like a primary defeater for the argument?
Yeah, so it's actually, in a lot of ways, something that Carroll says in different terms, where he says, like, yeah, you know, as like a naturalist, we try to like come up with models that fit the data, right? Like all we can do is like throw things at what we see that fit to explain it, right? But like up to a certain point, that doesn't work, because like maybe the rules just weren't the same. In fact, they almost certainly weren't the same.
Right. Our understanding of physics breaks down at the moment of the start of the Big Bang. Like our mathematical models fall apart.
Right, and it's just like there's no evidence to say anything about it. We can't say it existed. We can't say it didn't exist. So all we can do is create models that make things work.
Right.
Given what we see.
And that actually moves me a little bit into my second point when you talk about what exists or what doesn't exist. We are fundamentally trapped in concepts of temporality and concepts of three-dimensional space. We're speculating about what happened before the first moment of the universe, but we're not even certain that that concept is coherent, because as far as we know it, time began at the moment of the Big Bang. That's when space and time came into existence. So what does it mean to say something was before the first moment of the universe? What does it mean to say that something is outside of our space-time experience? Are those even coherent concepts? Can we even form proper concepts for these kinds of ideas? I don't think that we can. it's possible higher level physics has been able to come up with some ideas like on this, but for the most part, we're just, even our very language is bound to space-time concepts, and you can see this throughout the debate.
Yeah, like I was about to note there, like even the words that we use, right? Like they're just probably not accurate. Like they, all we can do is give meaning to like these things that we see, but like, when I say the word time and like, we think it like works linearly, but like, does it really? Like we
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
we don't think of things in terms of what they actually are, just what they mean to us.
Right. Exactly. It's very much.
And that happens a lot with Craig.
Yeah. And you even see Carroll bring this up. Dr. Carroll brings this up during the debate. He's like, it's not correct to say the universe popped into existence. That's a temporal concept. What it's right to say is there was a first moment of time.
I'm pretty sure nobody cares about my opinion about God's atemporality, so I will use this as an excuse to reiterate my objection to the language of coming into existence or popping into existence. That is not what the universe does, even in models where the universe has a beginning, a first moment. Because the verb popping, the verb to pop, has a temporal connotation, is the word I'm looking for. It sounds as if you waited a while and then pop, there was the universe. But that's exactly wrong. The correct statement is that there are models that are complete and consistent in which there's a first moment of time. That is not the same as to say that there was some process by which the universe popped into being. That's yet another difference between the universe and things inside the universe.
And what happened before that? Does that even make sense? We don't know. So I mean, asking us to try and understand this stuff is like asking an early human 200,000 years ago or 200 million years ago, however long we've been around, 200,000, I think. But anyway, what the true nature of a star is. I mean, they just have no frame of reference. They're not any stupider than we are. Their brains were the same as ours. They were just as intelligent. They just lacked data. They lacked information. And I think that's where we're at with this kind of a question. We don't have a framework to answer it yet. So, premise one, as it's typically presented, everything that begins to exist has a cause. He specifies it to the universe, and he also tacks on, if the universe began to exist, it has a transcendent cause. I thought it was funny because he glosses over this. He says, I take this first precedent premise as being self-evident. And he just spins over it. But I've made way more notes on this first premise than I have on anything else in the debate because it's not self-evident. I mean, in an intuitive way it was. And this is where you keep going back to Craig playing off intuition. And I remember the first Craig debate I ever heard was when I was a Christian. And this debate, this argument, the Kalam argument, if you don't look at it too deeply on a very fundamental intuitive level, it seems right. It seems obviously right as you read through it, because it is our day-to-day experience that there's cause and effect. Things just don't happen without a reason. Especially when you're talking about physical processes and things like that.
Yeah, and this is kind of like a weird bit of intersection because I also read philosophy. But I don't know if anyone that's listening has ever read Mill, but like culture gets brought up in this debate at one point by Carroll. And Mill kind of brings up when he's like arguing for like, classic liberty crap that all of us use, is that a lot of what people think of as self-evident claims, things that we ought to abide by, blah, 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 are actually just culture from the time. They're just uninvestigated ideas that continue to not be investigated because people say it's not worth our time.
Right.
Because they say we already have the answers.
Right.
And that's kind of exactly what we see going on here.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
It's just like he claims we have the answers.
So, talking about rational intuition, this is one of Craig's defenses of his first premise. Basically, it is our universal common human experience that we have cause and effect, that things don't happen for a reason. And to a certain extent, this rational intuition is justified. And I want to bring this up for a couple of reasons. First of all, like, scientific inquiry is based on this a bit. If you think about, and I've mentioned this in one of my other videos, nuclear decay rates. We have studied nuclear decay rates very carefully, and we've never found instances where they change. We can't find any way to change them. So we assume that they're constant and have been constant through time. And we have a lot of technology that hangs on this, like smoke detectors work because we have constant and very accurately measurable nuclear decay rates. And the reason why I adopted the Black Swan moniker for my channel is because I have this sort of intuition reasoning into my worldview. And it kind of, the brief version is, it goes like this. There are claims of supernatural events. Of the ones we have been able to investigate, they've all turned out to be bunk, or we don't have an answer for them. None of them have been demonstrated to actually be caused by something other than a natural event. So it is my rational intuition at this point, and a tentatively held position, it's open to change, that the supernatural realm just doesn't exist until I have a good reason to believe it. And I know I've definitely thought to challenge the Kalam on this idea, claiming it's a black swan fallacy, but I think there is a difference between justified rational intuition and a black swan fallacy. And part of that has to do with the sample size that you're looking at. And again, the whole idea of cause and effect and things just don't happen for no reason, that's a pretty universal sample size in the human species.
And it's also like the conclusions that you try and draw out of it, honestly, is like the biggest indicator for me. Right? Like if you say, hey, I'm like open to interpretation, right? It's like actually something that you kind of saw with like Zindler in one of those debates. So it's like, yeah, I can't draw the conclusion that God exists. And like that's kind of like where that ends realistically in these debates. And also, I don't have a good reason.
Also, the rational intuition does break down at times. I mean, this is why the double slit experiment is so famous. And also, if you think, I don't know, like a couple of 100 years ago when people were investigating light, we had figured out that light was a wave. And we know, or they knew then, that waves need a medium to propagate through. Hence, they proposed the luminiferous ether in outer space, which was the medium for light to travel through. That was the rational intuition at the time. And it turns out light is a self-propagating wave that also functions like a particle. Who knew? So there are definitely times, even in scientific inquiry, where this rational intuition can break down and does break down. Another point that Craig uses to defend this is what's called the reductio ad absurdum, which I'm sure I just mangled pronouncing it. Tell us what that is, Vinny. What is a reductio ad absurdum?
All right. So I haven't heard this term in a while. So my understanding is it's kind of just arguments. Again, it's kind of like based on intuition, which is why it's good to bring up here. Where it's like, if things just kind of like could pop into existence, right? Like, because he says like the universe began to exist and like things don't just pop into existence.
Right.
If
and I'll
it were,
put the clip of him saying that.
Secondly, if the universe could come into being from nothing, then why is it that only universes can pop into being out of nothing? Why not bicycles and Beethoven and root beer? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? If universes could pop into being out of nothing, then anything and everything should pop into being out of nothing. Since it doesn't, that suggests that things that come into being have causes.
Go ahead.
Right, if they were, then like we should see it, right? Like, you know, maybe some like crazy ant dancing in a top hat and cane just pops up behind me for a moment and then disappears, right? Things like need of cause, because if there's no cause, then anything could happen.
Right.
Right? Like,
right. Yeah. If the universe can pop into existence, why doesn't everything pop into existence? And I'm going to put this clip in here. Again, this is one of these moments. Pay attention to his vocal inflection, his facial expressions, and everything, because he's performing when he says this, without a doubt. But my counter to this argument of his specifically is that if we look at the macro things that we have in the universe, like stars, planets, people, manufactured things, these are all the continuing or end result of processes that are governed by physical laws. This is stuff when you have matter and energy and physical laws over time, these sorts of things are produced. I think that is fundamentally different than the universe popping into existence, because even if we're talking about the universe suddenly coming into existence, what are we talking about? If the Big Bang model is correct, we have a singularity, which is a point of almost infinite dense energy. It's not something that is the result of known processes. It's just a point of energy. And I think there's a category error here he's making between manufactured goods and the product of matter and energy over time through physical law, and just a point of energy coming into existence here. So I think this is an actual counter to the reductio, that you're talking about two entirely different things when you're asking, well, if this happens, then why doesn't this just suddenly happen?
Well, I would actually be a little bit more specific in that, like, I think there's actually real examples you can look at, right? Because, like, if you look at the universe as a system, because for all intents and purposes, like, that's what it is. That's all we can describe the universe as, is like a system that exists. And we don't have a capability to look outside of the universe. So that's like all we look at, right?
There's
like,
that spatial language again.
Right. So like, let's say we're looking at a different system, right? Like, let's say we're looking at the vacuum of space. We're just looking at this like 1 square foot cube in the vacuum of space.
Right.
Matter doesn't exist there. So how would matter just pop into existence? That doesn't make any sense, right?
It doesn't.
Because it doesn't exist within the system.
Within that frame of reference.
Right. But if, you can say that same thing about the universe. Like, it doesn't make sense that something would just come into the universe, into this like 1 foot square cube of universe.
See, that's a really intriguing thought, because that sort of supposes the idea that of a multiverse being a larger thing, and that like the energy for the universe, whatever was there already, and it just kind of moved into our frame of reference, or emerged into our frame of reference.
Yeah, we don't know. There's a lot of different models that could explain like how things like that work, but I'm not an expert in them.
No,
so.
and it's almost guaranteed that all those models are at least a little bit wrong, if not enormously wrong, because we're still working with very limited information. Back to the inductive reasoning. So it is our shared universal experience that we have cause and effect. Things just don't happen for no reason. If something begins to exist, there's a cause behind that. This is what I think is called an error of composition. Just because, let's assume for the sake of argument that that is a truism for things within the universe, we are not necessarily justified in saying that also applies to the universe as a whole. It could be, and again, this goes back to our lack of knowledge about how our universe was formed, how multiple universes are possibly formed. We just don't know the process or the forces behind it. So how can we say that there needs to be a cause? Is the idea of cause and effect even coherent outside of our space-time experience? I don't know.
And it's like also, I don't know if you want to get onto this later, but what do you mean by the word cause? Right?
Oh,
like,
yes.
I just picked up my phone. The cause for my phone being here is because I picked it up.
Let's get into that right now. This is one of Craig's defenses. So when you bring up the challenge of just because cause and effect is a known thing, the law of causation or whatever is an experience of us within the universe, how do we know it applies outside the universe? One of Craig's rebuttals to this is to bring up the difference between what he calls an efficient cause and a material cause. So I think the best way to explain this is with an analogy. Let's say you have a pot of boiling water, and you say, why is that water boiling? The material cause answer to that is because there's a source of heat underneath it that has raised its temperature to 100 Celsius. The efficient cause answer to that is because I wanted a cup of tea. So I put a water on to boil. When Craig goes to this, I think he automatically loses his first premise right out of the gate, because not everything that begins to exist in our common experience has an efficient cause. They might all have material causes, but they don't all have efficient causes. And another example I'm thinking of this is you compare the former old New Hampshire's Old Man in the Mountain with Mount Rushmore. Now, they both have material. These are both stone shapes that resemble human faces. They both have material causes, but only one of them has an efficient cause. So we know certainly that there are things that exist in our experience that do not have efficient causes. So I think by going to the argument of efficient causes, I think Craig just abandons his first principle. I don't see how he can apply that at that point.
Yeah, like my first thought here was like looking at things beginning to exist in the universe and like having a cause, right? Like the only things that have ever began to exist that I've ever observed are things that have began to exist because of an efficient cause, right? Like my cell phone exists because like someone decided I can make money off of selling these.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why are we talking about things like having a cause to exist? Like, can you even give an example of anything in the universe having a cause to exist? You know what I mean?
What do you mean? You mean larger
Like,
things in the universe?
no, like literally anything, right? Like, why is the physical material here? Like, what caused it other than like, yeah, we like trace it back?
Oh, well, I mean, you can trace causes back to the first moment of the Big Bang. I mean, that's, again, now you're getting into
The meat of his argument, really.
right, but determinism. I mean, you can trace. There is a very interesting question there about whether or not anything actually has an efficient cause. If you believe in determinism, then essentially everything boils down to material causes.
Yeah, and that's like kind of the where I'm getting at with this argument. Like, I don't know why he talks about things as if they have a cause other than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, we kind of like acknowledge some type of determinism over the course of this debate because he like kind of argues in it,
Yes.
which is really interesting. Like, because it's like all of his center premises are like, or his center premise is in terms of probabilities.
Right. Yeah.
And he like boils the debate down into that direction while his first premise is like based on it not boiling in that direction, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Another question that comes up in the same sort of sphere of things having a cause, thinking specifically things beginning to exist. And again, I feel like this is a bit of a category error here. Have we ever actually observed anything beginning to exist in the same sense that he's talking about with the universe?
That's what I'm trying to get at, yeah.
Right. So generally speaking, what we're talking about is the rearrangement of energy and matter into different forms. And then often we give labels to those forms. But when he's talking about the universe beginning to exist, now we're talking about an actual creation event where there was not energy before and now there is energy.
There wasn't observable energy before. There wasn't energy in our system.
Right. And again, these are just these deep questions around this. Was there, see, the model that I have in my head that I think is fun is the idea of the multiverse essentially being an endless quantum field. And every now and then, some bit of it, based on probabilities, goes through a phase change and a universe happens as the energy transforms into a big bang into what we have now. I mean, there's no more science behind that than there is against any other model, but it's an interesting idea. So, but yeah, that kind of touches, was the energy always there and it's just changing? Or was the energy not, was there just nothing and then something happened? Is nothing even a coherent idea? Does nothing have any properties? Can there actually be a nothing?
I work enough with math to say yes. Nothing is in fact a mathematical concept.
It is. What about infinity?
Yes, it is a very yeah. There are things that can go infinite. Like I build them. I build automatas. I build finite and infinite automatas. So
Nice. Finite and infinite automatas.